This chapter presents details about the DMAIC methodology for improving processes. And it also presents the DMADV methodology used to build a brand new process. Recall that Six Sigma has two related meanings. Number one is a statistical level of quality. Specifically, a process with a Six Sigma level of quality has virtually zero defects. And then number two, it's a process improvement methodology. That is, DMAIC is a structured approach to improve processes to achieve higher levels of quality. This chapter is about the latter with DMAIC and the associated idea of DMADV for new processes. Again, DMAIC stands for define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. And we'll break down each of these steps later in this chapter. Teams can follow the structured approach of DMAIC to rigorously and scientifically evaluate and improve existing processes. The key word there is existing. In some cases, we may need to build new processes from scratch. And for that, we'll use a similar approach called DMADV. Define, measure, analyze, then design and validate. Notice that the first three steps of DMADV are the same as DMAIC. And we'll break down those two different steps, design and validate, later in this chapter as well. The text notes that some DMAIC projects can actually become DMADV ones. For instance, after an initial investigation in the define and measure stages, it may make more sense sometimes just to build a new process. Again, the main difference between DMAIC and DMADV is the last two steps. DMAIC is for existing processes, and DMADV is for new processes. So let's consider some examples of when to use which. So first, suppose a business wants to create a new smartphone app to help customers make and arrange appointments. So creating a new app, meaning from scratch, would be DMADV. Or a company that manufactures pizza boxes isn't happy with the profit margins with the small size boxes. That is likely a DMAIC project, as we look to reduce costs without impacting quality via the existing process. And number three, suppose a doctor's office has complaints that it's too difficult to get appointments, and appointment communications are confusing. And to make matters worse, some patients show up and are told that they don't have an appointment. So as is, this could be DMAIC if we can find sufficient solutions in the existing process. But perhaps we find in the early stages of DMAIC that the underlying technology is highly insufficient. In that case, we might shift to DMADV to implement a completely new system and associated process. Again, the difference between DMAIC and DMADV is the last two steps, given the different focuses. DMAIC is about continuous improvement of existing processes, and DMADV is about engineering new processes. Still, both seek to improve quality, efficiency, and customer satisfaction by uncomplicating seemingly enormous objectives into tolerable steps. And the text calls this breaking up the elephant. And then both provide control and organization for the project, including keeping everyone on task. So we'll now dig into the different steps, focusing initially on DMAIC. Remember, however, that the first three steps are the same for both DMAIC and DMADV. A DMAIC process starts with define, which is concerned with identifying the problem, defining the requirements for the project, and setting goals for success. And remember, define is the same for DMAIC and DMADV. In the define step, we'll create the project charter. And the point here is to get all team members, including the executive sponsor, on the same page with the project mission, scope, resources, and other key project elements. We'll also formulate the problem statement for the project. And recall that we already devoted an entire chapter to this. And then we'll develop measurable customer requirements. Every Six Sigma project relies on a thorough understanding of the voice of the customer, the VOC. And we'll create an as-is process map, meaning how does the process function now? And it may be helpful to start with a SIPOC diagram, supplier input, process output, customer. And we already discussed that in another chapter as well. And then we'll also identify internal and external stakeholders. That is, who will influence the success of the project. As tips and challenges in the define stage, the sponsor and team should look to create positive, targeted momentum. And also, the sponsor should set clear expectations and communicate their support. And we should also establish the ground rules for how the project will run, including meeting organization and management, and communication, and team responsibilities, such as the scribe and the timekeeper. Ideally, we'll then have a toll gate review, meaning a milestone meeting, as we move from the define step to the measure step. As we discussed previously, the toll gate review pushes for progress and keeps everyone up to date. Still, the DMAIC and DMADV steps usually overlap. The boundaries are blurry, so the sponsor can make the call about when the team is ready to push forward. The next step, which again is the same for both DMAIC and DMADV, is measure. When teams use data to validate their assumptions about the process and the problem. And the text calls measure the most challenging phase. In this measure step, we'll create a baseline metric for the process, meaning how should the process be measured? And how is the process really performing, meaning a baseline, including the process sigma. We'll also refine the problem statement if evidence points us in unexpected directions. And we may also redirect the team if the initial measures aren't providing sufficient insight into the process. And then we'll apply tools discussed in other chapters, such as CTQ trees and process sigma. As teams begin to understand the full depth and complexity of the process during the measure step, they may enter a storming stage where they start questioning the viability of the project, or rail against the sponsor and or the team lead, or maybe complain about the workload and time, or even just stop showing up and participating. A good leader can recognize storming and redirect that energy into productivity and progress. Again, the text calls measure the most challenging to make step, meaning that projects can just fall apart in this step. So as tips and challenges, the entire team needs strong observation skills, and they should understand the reasons for the measures. The team also needs strong statistical and analytical skills, as well as knowledge of different data types. And they can rely on the Six Sigma leader for help when needed here. Finally, the project leads can demonstrate a calm approach as the team encounters storming. And again, at the end of the measure step, we'll have another toll gate review. The third step, which again is the same for DMAIC and DMADV, is analyze. This is where teams validate the hypotheses about the underlying issues in the process. So in the analyze step, we'll identify the true root causes of the problem, which should directly relate to the problem statement from the defined step. We'll also verify the causes with statistics and data. And we'll even begin to evaluate potential solutions, including starting the to-be process documentation. And we'll apply tools that we've discussed previously, like Pareto charts, as well as ones that are not covered in the text, such as run charts, cause and effect diagrams, and value analysis. As tips and challenges in the analyze stage, project leaders can keep redirecting storming as the team feels overwhelmed. And the Six Sigma lead can provide statistics training, as well as make sure to present the information in a way that's understood by all. After another toll gate review, we move to the fourth step, improve. And this step is unique to DMAIC. Here we further develop ideas that began in the analyze phase and use data and real-world observation to test hypotheses and solutions. So we'll select the final solution, meaning the improved process, and this solution will directly address the root causes identified in the analyze phase. And then we should take care to implement one change at a time. And we have to be careful in this step because the text warns that the most common problem that plagues Six Sigma teams during the improve phase is project fatigue. Our team just runs out of gas. So as tips, project leaders can create strength by building a strong foundation in the earlier DMAIC phases. And project leads can also foster a team approach, keeping the entire team involved and resisting the urge to complete the project on their own. Furthermore, the text highlights that the best solution is not always the one that offers the most improvement. Specifically, solutions that are too expensive or overly disruptive may have impacts that outweigh the benefits. And after the next toll gate review, teams move to the control step, which, like improve, is unique to DMAIC. Control is where the process is transitioned to a daily work environment. So the idea of control is that the process does not revert to the previous version once the attention and support from the project team are gone. So as key tasks and deliverables will transition the improved process to the owner. Furthermore, we'll establish ongoing metrics to track the new process. And we'll create a foundation for process discipline, meaning ensure that the new process sticks. Don't let it go back to the way it was. We'll also finalize documentation, and we'll apply tools, some of which are not covered in the text, including documentation checklists, control charts, response plans, and process dashboards. And in general, we'll just wrap up any loose ends. The text promotes ending on a positive note. Specifically, the team can celebrate their efforts and accomplishments, including recognizing individual efforts. And one way to do so is project leaders can have team members present the results to let them have some of the spotlight. And you can incorporate these ideas, including the celebration, as part of the final tollgate review. We'll now switch gears to the DeMadvi methodology, which again is applied to new processes. And the text extends this to products and services as well. The main difference from DMAIC is the last two steps, design and verify, instead of improve and control. So we'll focus on those last two steps, starting with design. In this design step, we'll create the new process and or product or service, including possibly working with suppliers and manufacturers as part of production. And then we'll test it, usually in a limited production environment, such as beta testing with a few customers, and then using the subsequent feedback for refinements. The text identifies design as the most critical phase of DMADV. So as tips, the project lead should closely watch for signs of project fatigue, just like we do in DMAIC. Likewise, target dates should be realistic. And again, the project leader should demonstrate strength as well as foster a team approach, keep the team involved. And with this design step, we should be aware of the related idea of design for Six Sigma. You design it for a Six Sigma level of quality. The idea is to design the product or service or process to a high level of quality, ideally zero defects in that spirit of Six Sigma quality, thus preventing defects from even occurring in the first place. After another tollgate review, DMADV moves on to the final step, verify. Like control, in verify, we transition the finished process or product or service back to the process owner. And we apply tools such as control charts and further CTQ trees. And as tips and challenges, the text cautions that DMADV generally has a longer timeline than DMAIC, possibly several years. So watch for project fatigue. And the text also warns of the challenge associated with team members transitioning back to their regular jobs after the project. That transition can be a bit of a letdown for them. And like the control step of DMAIC, we also want to ensure a positive close to the project with celebration and recognition. Again, we can incorporate celebration and recognition as part of the final tollgate review. So summarizing, DMAIC and DMADV are structured methodologies to drive process innovation and higher levels of quality. Again, these methods break up the elephant, parsing seemingly enormous objectives into tolerable steps, and they provide control and organization for the project, including keeping everyone on task. Okay, so that is a wrap.